This was filmed by Hearst, I believe, for a presentation around the country. So actually, I got some of the facts a little bit wrong.
In this great auditorium under the sky, all of us are free. When God gave us this wonderful outdoors, and the sun, the moon, and the stars, He made no distinction of race or creed or color. And 130 years ago, He sent to us one of His truly great, in order that He might restore freedom to those from whom we had disregardfully taken it. In carrying out this great task, Abraham Lincoln laid down his life. And so it is as appropriate as it is fortunate that today we stand reverently and humbly at the base of this memorial to the great emancipator, where glorious tribute is rendered to his memory by a daughter of the race from which he struck the chains of slavery. Facing us down the mall beyond the Washington Monument, which we have erected as a symbol of the towering stature and fame of him who founded this republic, there is rising a memorial to that other great Democrat in our short history, Thomas Jefferson, who proclaimed that principle of equality of opportunity which Abraham Lincoln believed in so implicitly and took so seriously. In our own time, too many pay mere lip service to these twin planets in our democratic heaven. There are those, even in this great capital of our democratic republic, who are either too timid or too indifferent to lift up the light that Jefferson and Lincoln carried aloft. Genius, like justice, is blind. For genius, with the tip of her wing, has touched this woman, who, if it had not been for the great mind of Jefferson, if it had not been for the great heart of Lincoln, would not be able to stand among us today a free individual in a free land. Genius draws no color line. She has endowed Marian Anderson with such a voice as lifts any individual above his fellows, as is a matter of exultant pride to any race. And so it is fitting that Marian Anderson should raise her voice in tribute to the noble Lincoln whom mankind will ever honor. We
So, seemingly a minor event, and yet it actually was understood in the country at the time as having profound significance. Why? Because while Roosevelt himself stayed silent, his administration organized this alternative concert. The Secretary of Interior, speaking at it, was announcing essentially a new policy, and Mrs. Roosevelt's resignation from the Daughters of the American Revolution, and her public statements were understood to be a firm condemnation by the Roosevelt administration of the racial politics as it was organized in the United States. That meant it was, in a sense, a message to civil rights activists that if you push us, we will not push back, we will respond with positively to your requests. Trade unionists, black trade unionists in particular, led by A. Philip Randolph from the Pullman Porters Union, began organizing what would come to be called the Double V campaign. If the United States goes to war, there would be two victories at the end of the war. The victory over fascism abroad and the victory over racism at home. And Randolph and the trade unionists planned in 1941 a massive march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in the military. Knowing that war was likely to happen sometime that year, Roosevelt viewed the march as a serious embarrassment. And he wanted to project an image of national unity rather than a continued fighting over internal policies within the United States. Randolph called off the protest march when the Roosevelt administration signaled to him that Roosevelt would issue an executive order prohibiting racial discrimination in firms that received federal contracts. And this would be very important in war industry hiring. And Roosevelt also agreed to establish a Fair Employment Practices Commission to monitor employer compliance, accept and investigate complaints, and to enforce anti-discrimination policies. The federal government, for the first time, had said, we will use our power to combat racial discrimination throughout the country and racial segregation in the South. This did not make people in Congress very happy, this policy. But Roosevelt stuck to his guns, and he created these new policies and a new governing body through an executive order. African Americans proclaimed this as the first step in the path towards a double victory. Now, this did not mean, this was the beginning step that would include an opening of employment and sometimes of unions to people who had been excluded. And it would lead, in I think it's 47, to President Truman integrating the military. It did not mean that race relations in the United States were changing overnight, nor did anybody, either in the civil rights groups or in the Roosevelt administration, think that they were going to change overnight. There was still segregation in much of the country. There were still lynchings. There were still race riots. But the playing field was beginning to change. And the government, the federal government, with its eye on international affairs, was going to begin to take a more active role. And we now know, it took many years later, that the State Department was filing secret briefs friend of the court briefs with the Supreme Court when cases came to the Supreme Court regarding racial discrimination, arguing supporting increased civil rights and arguing that the current state of race relations in the United States was doing incalculable harm to the United States and giving aid and support to the country's enemies. Perhaps the biggest single contradiction in all of this, on the one hand, a move forward to combat racial discrimination and to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act, but at the same time, there's the internment of the Japanese American population, 100,000 plus people. Those who lived in the western states, Oregon, Washington, and California, relocated to camps in the desert, in the interior, or in 2 camps in Arkansas. Supposedly on the basis that this was a national security need, to protect the country from the dangers of potential Japanese invasion, a population that might harbor Japanese agents had to be removed. If that were the accurate explanation, then why weren't Japanese Americans in Hawaii interned? Indeed, Japanese Americans continued to live in their homes and go to their work because if they had been interned, the territory of Hawaii would have shut down and the military operations in Hawaii would have shut down. They were, however, required to wear a black circle on their armbands, perhaps not so dissimilar from the Star of David that Jews had to wear in Nazi Germany, and they had a curfew, so they could not be out in the streets after dark, essentially. How do we explain this contradiction? I'm not sure that we can, other than people are complex, societies are complex. On the one hand, we move to do certain things. On the other hand, we move in an opposite direction. Perhaps it's for the first time the federal government is exercising on a large scale an absolute authority to round up citizens that it doesn't trust. It doesn't have to justify it other than on the grounds that it can't have absolute trust. When the Cold War